Thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started in 1 minute. In the chat, you will see a link for today's program with extended bios of all of our panelists. Thank you.
Great, we'll get started in just another 30 seconds or so. Welcome. All right, I think we will go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Jennifer Mnookin, and I have the good luck of serving as Dean here at UCLA School of Law, and I very much appreciate you joining us today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that UCLA School of Law sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As members of a land-grant institution, we at UCLA pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. I want to welcome you now to this latest installment in our From the Front Lines virtual series. In these uncommonly challenging times, we at UCLA Law School are very fortunate to have faculty, alums, and friends who are among the foremost experts in so many of the legal, social, and political issues at the heart of the current conversation. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation for their foundational support of our criminal justice program, as well as trustees Martin Blank and Richard Ziman. We are really grateful for your support that permits this program, as well as so much of our criminal justice program activities. Now, for today's conversation, can Los Angeles reduce its jail population? We're especially lucky to have experts with some connection to UCLA Law and UCLA Law alums working in the community around this issue. In recent years, LA County has focused on alternatives to incarceration in order to try to reduce the population in jails, transforming our criminal and juvenile legal processes. We're going to dive into this today, exploring Los Angeles County's approach, what progress has been made, and what challenges still exist. I'm delighted to get to moderate today, and I'm going to do extremely brief introductions of our very distinguished panelists. I encourage you to follow the link in the chat to read more about our panelists and their accomplishments. First, please welcome Sharon Dolovich, professor of law and the faculty director of our UCLA Prison Law and Policy program, and who also co-founded UCLA Law COVID Behind Bars. Welcome, Sharon. Next, please welcome Honorable Peter Espinoza, class of 1980, and the director of Los Angeles County Health Services Office and retired LA County Superior Court judge. Welcome back, Judge Espinoza. Next, please welcome Honorable Songai Miguda Armstead from the class of 03, executive director of LA County's Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative and a retired judge also from the LA County Superior Court. Welcome, Judge Armstead. Last but certainly not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Saul Sarabia, founder and director of Solidarity Consulting, who also spent a number of years working at UCLA Law School, directing our critical race studies program. Welcome back, Saul. It's terrific to see you as well. Couple quick reminders. You are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A, and we will make time to address some of the questions that we get from the audience. And so please feel free to do that. And again, thank you so much for being with us. Let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to start just by inviting all panelists to introduce themselves and the work that they do that's relevant to this panel. and why that's important. So I gave you these very, very short introductions. I'd love to give you the chance to say a little bit more, especially as it connects to these questions around incarceration and decarceration in Los Angeles and also nationally. Judge Armstead, could I start with you?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. As we know, I love UCLA. I'm a very proud Bruin, so I'm glad to be in this space. Let's see. So first, I'd like to say that I retired from the bench really because I was frustrated about not having enough opportunities to link people to services. So I would see people quite often in the courtroom. And also as a prosecutor, I saw people quite often in the courtroom who really needed resources and services and not jail. And we didn't have enough opportunities to link them to those services. And so when this opportunity presented itself, I did retire from the bench to take this position. Our office was originally tasked with sort of standing up resources within the community as alternatives to incarceration. And that is one of our roles. We have now taken on quite a number of other roles, right? And sort of prioritizing what community-based care resources and opportunities can look like for LA County. So in addition to that, the board has tasked us with other branches of really their care first and jail's last vision. And so what does that mean? That means we've been given Measure J, which I'm sure many of you guys are familiar with, which the board has now coined CFCI, which is Care First and Community Investment. We are tasked with sort of looking at youth justice reform and what does it look like when law enforcement is not involved in the youth justice space. We are tasked with pretrial services. And then I also co-chair Alternative Crisis Response, which is standing up 988 by July of next year for the County of Los Angeles. So how do we respond to folks in crisis, an alternative to law enforcement response? We are also tasked with building this new unit from scratch. So before I got here, it did not exist. And so if you know anything about government, it's not a small task. It's a very complex task to, hire and build. So it didn't exist. I was the first employee, and now we have about 7, including support staff. So through these additional tasks, we have advanced the will of the voters who approved Measure J. We were successfully able to go through, and Judge Espinosa went through this with several meetings and lots of hours, budget and fund nearly $200 million into Care First and Jails Last, which is huge. It's never been done in the county, which will be going to programs and services. Originally, the county allocated about $100 million, but we were able to leverage federal funds to find more than another $87 million that we'll be able to do. And that was done through a lot of stakeholder participation and engagement. We've also been able to launch and or expand 3 new programs, 2 of which are diversion. One is to help develop grassroots organizations from the ground up through Incubation Academy. We're working on an app to help link folks to services right away. And in year 2, we'll continue to work on our new role of really working on policy coordination, planning, and sort of budget alignment within the county in the spaces of justice reform. So that's really our carry. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Really, really helpful beginning of understanding of the important work your unit's doing. Peter, let me turn to you next. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
Sure. Let me just tell you what a pleasure it is to be here today. As you can tell from reviewing the bio materials that were included in your packet, I attended UCLA during the Jurassic period. It's great to be here amongst all the young minds that are changing lives in Los Angeles County. I am the director of the Office of Diversion and Reentry and have been since 2016. I'm going to focus, I think, later in the program on the work we do, the jail-based diversion work we do, pulling mentally ill folks out of the jail. But I want to mention some other projects related to this topic that we have been tasked with doing by the Board of Supervisors. We were directed about 2.5 years ago to pull together the Alternatives to Incarceration work group, which we did. The process took a little over a year. Hours and hours of public stakeholder engagement with county departments resulted in the Alternatives to Incarceration Work Group report that also resulted in the creation of the Alternatives to Incarceration Initiative, which Judge Armstead is chairing. In addition to that work group, in response to the pandemic, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, the jail population in Los Angeles County was reduced by slightly over 30% from an average daily census 17,500 to at its lowest just under 12,000. The board saw this as an opportunity to begin creating a plan for the closure of Men's Central Jail, and it directed the Office of Diversion and Reentry and the Sheriff's Department to put together a work group. We did that. That group again met and engaged with the public for hours and hours and hours in countless meetings that resulted in a very concise roadmap for the board to follow to reduce the population further and close Men's Central Jail within 18 to 24 months. The board has recently created a new department that will begin the work of closing Men's Central Jail. Finally, during the period of time where the jail population was reduced, the board saw an opportunity to create what is known as the Jail Population Review Council, which is chaired by the Office of Diversion and Reentry. It's one of my responsibilities currently. We are again engaging mostly law enforcement, but not exclusively law enforcement stakeholders, all stakeholders across the community to analyze what's working, what's not working in our ongoing quest to further reduce the jail population. I just want to give a shout out to 2 UCLA alumni who have been key to the work that I've just described. All 3 of those work groups were ably led by Karen Tamas, who was a graduate from the law school 2005 from the public law section. And then our deputy director at ODR, Rohini Kahana, who is a 2009 graduate of UCLA and was in the critical race studies specialization program. None of these programs existed during the Jurassic period, so I don't know much about them other than they produced 2 amazing lawyers that really understand criminal justice transformation, not just reform, but transformation, and are very mission driven in that regard. Thank you very much for having me, and I'll wait to respond to further questions.
That's great. And thank you for the shout outs for 2 other phenomenal UCLA law alums. And yes, we are very proud of both our public interest law and policy program, our Epstein program in public interest law, and also our critical race studies program. So thank you for mentioning both. You've actually given me great links to both of our next presenters. You talked about COVID in the LA County situation. Sharon, can you tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing?
Yeah, so I'm on the faculty here at the law school, as Jennifer said, and I teach a bunch of classes related to incarceration, prison law, an 8th Amendment seminar as it applies to prison sentences and prison conditions. And I also teach a class that's unusual in law schools, which covers the back end of the system. So starting from sentencing and ending with reentry and everything in between. So it's a focus that most law school curricula don't offer, but we have it here at UCLA. And when I started recognizing that we had so many students who were interested in this set of issues, and I have many colleagues also interested in this set of issues, we launched 8 years ago the Prison Law and Policy Program, which is sort of committed to both educating the students at the law school about this set of legal issues so that they understand that issues related to incarceration and everything that happens in the shadow of incarceration are very central to the American legal system, not just ancillary to the pretrial verdict in the criminal context, and also to train the next generation of prisoners' rights lawyers. And I'm proud to say that we have many alums of the program who are working full-time on behalf of incarcerated people. More recently, as Dean Mnuchin mentioned, I have been working on the issue of COVID and incarceration. Starting at the beginning of the pandemic, I hesitate to say I launched, but I guess I began working on gathering data around COVID and incarceration around the country. I hesitate to sort of take agency because it happened so quickly and the whole thing came together so quickly, but before I knew it, we had something going called the UCLA Law COVID-19 Behind Bars Data Project. And we now have 7 staff and over 100 active volunteers. We have many students involved, and we do a number of things. One of the main things we do is we scrape all of the COVID-related data from corrections agencies' websites around the country. So we track COVID, excuse me, infections and tests and deaths for incarcerated people and staff in every prison system in the country. And those jail systems that post the data, most jails, we have 3,200 jails in the country, and most have provided no COVID data. We're not even sure that they're gathering it themselves. But the biggest jail systems in the country, including LA County Jail, have been gathering and posting and disseminating data. So we have some sense of what's going on inside. And I'll say more about that now. I'll just make the point that we think that our data is undercounting what's going on for reasons I can explain. And I'll just say that the other thing that we do is we focus in a more qualitative way, leveraging our quantitative data to sort of put into the public debate arguments about the need for data transparency around what happens inside carceral facilities, and also to try to make arguments for what should change, including we're working on a big project on compassionate release, which I'm also happy to mention when you come back to me.
Great, thank you, Sharon. And now, Saul, I want to turn to you, and you obviously did a great deal to help build our critical race studies program, and now you're on to doing other exciting things. Tell us something about those.
Absolutely, thank you, Dean Mnookin, and everyone for coming together. I was just describing my excitement because we don't often get a lot of opportunities to reflect about the work that we're doing on the ground, and to do that with the UCLA Law family is a special treat. So it's great to see everyone. And indeed, I'm grateful to say that I'm both an alum of class of '96 and also former staff as the founding administrative director of the Critical Race Studies program. And to Judge Espinoza's point, I'm just going to say the specializations didn't exist even for those of us who graduated in '96, and I was fortunate to come back and work with some of the folks that you're describing, and to learn about the great work that the institution was doing to institutionalize how we might support law students and other legal professionals who are interested in using their law degrees to get involved directly in the civic engagement process, to get involved in the ways that society is coming together to undo major social problems like structural racism. And thankful that our institution is committed to building that out. So for me, that has involved linking the work that I have done since I graduated at the law school, which is really about supporting community-based leaders to get involved in the process of public policy making, and supporting those who are already involved in changing the legal system to address some of these persistent issues. When I came to the law school in 2005, one of the initiatives that was already ongoing as a result of my work, I had the privilege of being trained as a community organizer by our now Congresswoman who represents UCLA in the Congress, Karen Bass, at the Community Coalition, an organization she founded in South Los Angeles in the middle of the crack epidemic. Congresswoman Bass is trained as a physician's assistant, and she was working in the ERs when the crack epidemic was ravaging Black communities throughout the United States, and doing that with the full support and resourcing of our public taxpayer dollars through a failed criminal justice approach to public health questions such as addiction, and really being a central vehicle by which to reproduce structural racism in the United States. And so having come out of that work and learning about the importance of involving directly impacted people in providing solutions to these types of issues, I was able to work with our critical race faculty and students to launch the Prisoner Reentry Initiative back in 2008, I believe. That has now become a permanent clinic through a program that Judge Espinoza and the La Raza law students of his generation created when they established El Centro Legal as the first community clinic, which now has become the largest student organization on the campus and provides students with an opportunity to gain practical skills. And so for me, what it meant to partner the law students with the community-based change agents was to have them come together to look at these issues from the perspective of public policy and how we could support directly impacted people to ensure that they could not just inform, but lead the charge around these changes. And I will say that I had spent all of that time really focused on the adult side. And I had a crash course on what was happening in our juvenile justice space in 2018, when the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors contracted me to serve as the chair of its probation reform and implementation team. Our immediate charge was to establish the legal powers, the staffing, and the structure for a new oversight body, the only oversight body over a probation department in the United States, to deal with many of the gaps and the structural failures of our existing probation department. And in doing so, we were also asked to take hundreds of recommendations that had already been made in several audits by the county's own auditing department and several research reports that were done by very able researchers around the country to create a systemic reform plan for the probation department. We did that, but we accomplished both of those things. You can look up the Probation Oversight Commission. I encourage you, if you're interested in tracking further what's happening with the juvenile justice reform, to do that through that body that has now been erected, but also through the reports that we produced, where we actually went beyond our charge. And our body essentially said to the county, you need to end all youth incarceration by 2025. And what we have, if we're going to talk about, Jurassic and medieval periods, what we have is a medieval juvenile justice system where folks have referred to the juvenile hall in Los Angeles as a dungeon. At least they did to me as I was in my role as the PRIT chair. And since then, when we did that, we recommended that the board invite community stakeholders to look at what could replace the existing system. And we recommended that that inquiry involved looking at whether an existing health agency that could actually deal with the traumas that produce youth infractions and that understood something about the youth brain development science and criminology could actually be responsible for the handling of court-involved youth and preventing youth from becoming court-involved to begin with. And if not, if there could be a new department and entity charged with doing that. So what I'm doing now is, with a lot of these stakeholders, helping to actually create this new system, which is referred to as Youth Justice Reimagined. This Youth Justice Reimagined roadmap was also a product of a large stakeholder process that followed ours. And that is very much a reflection of where the thinking is now, but primarily reflects decades of wisdom and demands and actually system-produced traumas for communities of color that had been indicating to public policymakers that we were sinking billions of dollars into failed systems of incarceration that produced the highest rates of recidivism. And in terms of the question on this panel, how Los Angeles can reduce its jail population, we know that treating young people in these institutional settings without rehabilitation is one of the main ways to funnel people into the adult system. And that is what we are engaged in now to try to support the county to replace with our existing system. I'm looking forward to discussing what that looks like.
Great. Well, thank you all for these incredibly interesting glimpses of the important work that you're doing. I want to come back to Judge Armstead, and I actually have a pair of questions. One of them is I'd love to ask you, and if other panelists want to follow up on this same question, that's great too. But then I have another question for you too, Judge Armstead. But I'd love to sort of take the 30,000 foot perspective and we have people on the Zoom who are deeply immersed in this work. We also have probably some first-year law students who really don't know much about it. I'd love to ask from the 30,000 foot perspective, what does success look like? Like, what's the hope for how much decarceration would be manageable? What would a care modeled vision be if you could take the kind of ambitious but plausible version? Can you share that with us briefly?
Sure, that's a humongous question.
So we could spend the whole rest of the session on it.
Right. So I think the first thing that we have to realize is that there's a reason why there's a disproportionate amount of Black and brown folks in our justice system, right? And there's a reason why folks who are economically disadvantaged are in our justice system, right? So I think if we look at justice reform and we don't look at really giving communities the resources and opportunities that they need, that everyone else is entitled to, that we're all entitled to first, then we're doing a disservice. So if we're starting in how do we pull people out of the justice system, but we haven't started with how do we put jobs and healthcare and childcare and opportunity and hope back into communities, then we're starting too far down the trajectory. Part of my job here, the first year has been very, very interesting. I definitely came in with a particular look at what we could just do this, and this, and that would be the answer to it. But the answer is so much more complex, right? Because as we start to pull back the layers of the onion, we can really see that there's just the way things are handled in different communities is astronomical. I have friends that went to Malibu High School. They have a drug problem. Their parents put them in a rehabilitative program that overlooks the ocean, and they're great. In other communities, they have the same challenges, and jail is what the answer is. And there's no solution, there's no hope. And so we really have to do something different. We have to make sure that it's equity across the board in all communities. That's number one. The other thing is how we deal with crisis. So a flat tire to you and I is we call AAA. Someone comes and pops the tire, right? And they fix it and we go along our way. A flat tire to other folks means that I can't get to work, my kids can't get to school, I've lost my job, and now I'm housing unstable, right? And so we have to look about how do we intervene when it comes to crisis, right? And so it's interesting that I have these other tasks that have been added on, which really, we need more people to be able to look at all these tasks. But the way we respond to crisis has to be, so the first part is how do we put resources into communities, right? So that's the first thing. How do we make sure that people have safety nets and supports? The next question is how do we respond to crisis? If we do the first two well, we'll have a lot less people coming into the other entryways. And so success to me looks like in all the stages, we have supports that folks can come out. The reality is, and I know people don't want to hear this, is that there are some people who do belong in custody. There are some people who really cause more harm to the community than good. And unfortunately, it's also the people who are folks of color and who are disenfranchised who end up being the victims in those cases, right? So if we're able to sort out the folks who need help, give them the supports they need on the front end as soon as possible, and before they even fall into the system that becomes, circles, then we'll be able to do a better job. But then the second part is for those who do fall in, because we weren't able to catch them, we have to have as many exit points as possible. And so the work that Judge Espinosa does is phenomenal. We have other programs where folks can come in as soon as they're arrested in their book. There's a case manager and a service provider right there in the jail. And then there's people at arraignment. So at every stage, we're pulling people out. That's what success looks like for me. We know that it's going to take time. This is generational. It's been generations of things being done in not the best way that has built the system. Unfortunately, it probably will take several years to undo it, but there's going to need to be legislative changes. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's just raised, those are legislative changes. We've been looking at a lot of the recommendations and with county council, and unfortunately, the code says that probation officer will for a lot of these things, right? So those things also need to change. So I guess that's my short answer, but there's so much more to it. I don't want to take up everyone else's time.
No, that was fabulous. Thank you. I mean, it really gives us critically important context. Sharon, do you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I sign on to everything that Judge Armistead just described in terms of the big picture and changing the way we respond to people in the community and making equity across the board in all the ways that she described. The one piece I would just amplify is what incarceration continues to look like for the people that, as you know, as Judge Armistead said, for the sake of community safety, actually need to be incarcerated. And we know that in the jail population, that number is really quite small because there's so many people in jail who are either there because they couldn't make bail, right, because they didn't have the money in their pocket, or because they're on a probation violation or they're incarcerated for some minor misdemeanor. And I think one thing that COVID has shown us, and the decarceration movement in the early months of COVID has shown us, is many of those people don't need to be in custody. So the question is, you know, how do we get them out, and then how do we provide the kinds of services that Judge Armistead is describing that would actually facilitate a successful reentry. But the other piece of it that I would mention, which I think Judge Espinosa's work on closing Men's Central is directly related to, is that we nonetheless have to commit to humane conditions for the people who remain inside. And one of the things I should have mentioned in my introduction is some years ago, I did a detailed qualitative study in the LA County Jail, and I spent many weeks in Men's Central. And the conditions that I saw there, as many people know, you know, are really, as Sowell said, I mean, it's a dungeon, and it's the opposite of the conditions that we would need to help people reorient in a positive way, take advantage of the services that are available, think about how to develop themselves in a way that would enable safe and successful reentry. Some years ago, I visited prisons in Norway, and I was deeply influenced by what I saw there. One of the things I saw there, and this is a system that commits to treating people like human beings. And one of the things I saw there is, in terms of service provision, people in prison and jail are treated no differently than anyone else. So the same medical system that nationally provides medical care for people is in the prisons. And they just treat these people as patients in the way that people on the outside are treated as patients. The library is the prison library is a branch of the local library. And it's a reorientation of how we see people who are caught in the criminal justice system. And I think until we have a collective reorientation conceptually and normatively, nothing will change.
Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. Okay, Judge Armistead, I want to come back to you with the question I was going to ask before I asked you to sort of go big and describe the issue, which is, you began telling us a little bit about this already, but you know, you're the founding executive director of this new office, and you're tasked with envisioning this shift from incarceration as a default to prioritizing care and services, especially for members of marginalized communities. So where do you start? Like what's an immediate goal? And then also, how do you involve diverse communities in the work, especially given also the bureaucratic dimensions of just getting a new office started?
That's an excellent question. So we've had a crash course about community engagement, which definitely needs some tweaking, but you know, I started here, actually I'm coming up on my 1 year here at the end of the month. And within 3 months, we had 3 new initiatives, right? So we had youth justice, we had Measure J, we had alternative crisis response within 3 months, which are huge initiatives upon themselves. But I would say my best lesson around sort of community engagement was around the Measure J process. So the Measure J process, and Judge Espinosa will smile or attest to this, because he was one of the members of our committee. We had a 17-member body, and within that 17-member body, we had at least 200 folks on each call 6 times a week. And calls lasted anywhere between 2 hours and 5 hours, you know, because we're in a virtual space, so we couldn't do live in-person meetings, you know, because of COVID. So I would say that's a lot of community engagement. So within that, but the challenge with that is that even with the 200 people per call, 6 calls a week, we're still missing large parts of the community because there are folks who don't know, they're not affiliated with a certain organization. And so the board has written a new motion, which the board likes to do. They write lots of motions about what it looks like going forward. So now we'll have 24 people who are on the committee, some representing some organizations. But in addition to that, our task will be actually to go out to each of the different corners of the county based on sort of a mapping of underserved communities and really getting to the community. So we'll be doing much more of that now. I'm hoping to hire a community engagement person because we're trying to build our team who can really go out and be the listening and the ears and the engagement part. So we'll be doing a lot more of that in that way. There were two parts to the questions. The one was community engagement and how do we engage people? I forgot the first part, I'm sorry.
It was just about what of your first priorities over this past year?
So my priorities have changed. So the board gave me a directive that was very clear, like stand up these three things. So we stood up the three things they told us to stand up, and have launched each of them in some iteration. Contracting, all of that takes a long time in the county. The first thing I also did was look at data. And actually, perhaps Professor Dolovich can speak to this, but part of our task was like, what's the data? Where are the communities most impacted? Where are the biggest arrests? What's happening? And so we looked at data from 2019 and before, because we thought that was going to be our baseline to kind of figure out what are the charges, what are the communities, what's happening in the jails, what's happening in the courts. We didn't look at 2020 because everyone knows 2020 was not a predictor of anything other than what nightmares look like, right? And so what has happened though is that because of all of the civil activism that took place, Black Lives Matter, COVID, there's been a huge shift on the types of charges that people are arresting on. There's been a huge shift in the justice system. So all of the people that we would have been able to target, before they're arrested at booking and link them to services and resources, we're not able to because where the marker has totally gone to some other space. And so our baseline is not at all what it used to be. And what we're seeing is that the people that law enforcement are actually booking and bringing into custody and those that are actually in custody in court usually have multiple cases. They have more serious charges. They have outstanding bench warrants. And so that has made the charge a little bit, the way that the county originally envisioned some of the work happening, shifting a little bit. That's also a reason why some of the other work that's happening in other places like Judge Espinosa's work and other work is key because it can handle people that are more serious, who have more serious cases, folks that otherwise would go to prison, things like that. So a lot of that is shifting. That's one. Number two is that we're looking at budget. So we're realizing that there are a lot of things being funded because they've always been funded that maybe shouldn't be funded so that we can shift the money to community-based organizations, to more resources for services as opposed to traditional law enforcement. So we're looking at that. We're looking at other places where systems could be changed. If you can imagine LA County, what it's like to look at all of the different allocations of funding and to look at what's been happening over the years, it's more than a notion. So I think I answered your questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Judge Espinosa, Peter, I'd like to come back to you. The Office of Diversion and Reentry has done some groundbreaking work with diverting people with mental illnesses out of the jails and providing supportive resources, including housing and going beyond that, in some cases permanently. Can you talk to us in a little bit more detail about the specific needs of people with mental health issues who are incarcerated and how ODR's programs might differ from the traditional legal process that you saw?
Sure. Let me start by mentioning two things. One is I want to make sure I get a commitment from Professor Dolovich to join our jail population review council work because it sounds like she would be an incredible resource. And I'm going to have Karen Tamas reach out to you. Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I also don't want to lose the opportunity. The second is in terms of what success looks like for us, particularly with regards to Men's Central Jail closure and jail population review, we set quite clear goal for the board to reduce the population to 8,500, and at the same time setting up about 4,000 community-based beds to care for people who are currently in the jail suffering from mental illness. The RAND Corporation did a study of that population a couple of years ago and determined that more than 60% of the people currently being held in the jail who are suffering from serious mental illness could safely be removed using one of ODR's existing court-based strategies. So I think that's a good foundation for my response to your question. I'm going to try to be brief. I do a stump speech on ODR. It runs anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours. So I'm going to try to be a lot more precise here.
Right.
We have over the last 6 years removed 6,000 persons who are either suffering from a serious mental illness or a comorbidity because they are also suffering from a substance use disorder. We currently have 3,000 souls in our care. They're in our housing, receiving our wraparound clinical services and intensive case management services. These are folks who would either still be in jail, be in prison, or be in on the streets, homeless in Los Angeles County. Our criteria for our population coming out of the jail, generally speaking, they must be charged with a felony, they must have a history of homelessness or likely to become homeless, and a history of a serious mental illness. We have 5 interventions that have been helpful in reducing the population. These interventions need to be fully resourced so that we can further reduce the population. I'm just going to mention them briefly, and then if folks have any questions about how they work, I'm happy to answer them. The first 2 programs are our felony incompetent to stand trial program, where we are removing people from the state hospital wait list into community-based care to receive their restoration service. The second is the MIST program, which is, as it probably explains, the misdemeanor incompetent to stand trial program, where we use the same model to remove folks from the jail who have been declared incompetent by their lawyers and who would normally stay there, either until they're restored or until the maximum term prescribed by law expires and they have to be released. We have a community-based restoration program for those folks. Our most robust in the program, I think, well, I don't want to say I'm most proud of, I'm proud of all of our programs, but our felony pre-trial program, where we are identifying folks in the jail who have a serious mental illness or charged with a serious felony. It's important to know that we have no protocol that excludes people from our programming based on the nature of their offense. We'll take a referral on anybody and let the adversary process organically eliminate people that shouldn't be released from jail. We have 2,200 folks right now in beds who were charged with serious felonies and have a history of serious mental illness. We have a state hospital diversion program, which is diversion as lawyers understand it, PC 1000. We have 200 beds funded by the Department of State Hospitals, where we are diverting folks, including with charges as serious as attempted murder. If they satisfy their diversionary criteria during the time period they are diverted, their case gets dismissed. And finally, we operate what's called the maternal health program. In 2018, the board directed us to remove pregnant women from the jail whenever possible. And so we created a pretrial program for women who are pregnant. We remove them from the jail, provide them with all of the care that someone would need who is experiencing a pregnancy. By and large, these folks do not have acute mental illness problems, but other sort of unmet behavioral health needs that we address. We have removed somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 women since the program has been launched. Those are our 5 strategies that have allowed us to pull 6,000 folks out and allowed us to currently care for around 3,000. It's
Wow.
a lot more complicated than that, but that's
Right.
what
Thank you for that overview. I think many of us would love to hear I don't know about the multi-hour version, but I'd love the 30 to 60 minute version at some point. So we'd love to maybe have you come back and talk to some of our students about that.
Sure.
So I'd love to turn to you. You've already told us a little bit about your role helping to transform the Probation Commission into the Probation Oversight Commission. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the recommendations around limiting probation's role? Just tell us a little bit more about why the county's investing in that change, what steps are needed to make it even more of a reality.
Absolutely. And if we could have Harlisha post during the time I'm talking onto the chat, the link to the Youth Justice Reimagined report, people can get the details of really a historic change. Where I left off was that, we had made a recommendation that the county consider a shift in terms of having people who were trained in academies, law enforcement academies, and correctional careers, having primary jurisdiction over providing or ensuring that there were services being provided to young people that committed infractions and who were involved in the court system, replaced and transitioned over into a system that was really focused and driven by our understanding of youth development. The board has since then decided to accept phased transition into this new vision. And in that phased transition, what we're essentially seeing is the actualization of a long time demand by community members that these be seen as public health questions, as youth development questions. And so in the Youth Justice Reimagined concept, there will be a rolling out of a new department of youth development who would have jurisdiction over the care and the rehabilitation of young people who are system involved, and hopefully preventing them from becoming system involved. The more a youth is tied to the courts, tied to the law enforcement processes that have been traditionally used, the more penetration there is at on the adult side, on the adult system. And so I think that the highlight is that there has been an embrace of not just this logic, but the actual phases and the mechanics in the plan that have everything from removing probation officers from schools. Believe it or not, in this county, we were using something called voluntary probation, by which probation officers would be stationed in schools, and parents who had children who were having trouble or whatever, actually, were provided the probation officers as a resource. And as you can imagine, while there are some people who probably were very adept at changing gears from their law enforcement training to being good connectors to services, that is not what their jobs really trained them to do. And so there was a connection to the school to prison pipeline. That will now be replaced in this new vision by dedicated youth development workers who can respond to conflict, make sure that harm is repaired, and to ensure that there's mentorship for youth to grow. And the other element is in terms of who is conducting assessments, investigations. Probation officers, amongst all the things they have to do, is provide pre-plea reports and recommendations to the juvenile court. Any of our law students who've ever worked in any aspect of the youth criminal justice system can tell you that those reports vary in their quality, just to speak euphemistically. And these would now essentially be expanded so that a collaborative team of youth empowerment services team workers would help figure out what happened and find the best options for youth, advocate for them as they're being treated by the multiple systems that are supposed to serve them. And this would also imply that we actually do the work of investing in and creating a network of services in the community. So right now, in the community, probation officers conduct field supervision. They provide referrals that sometimes materialize, don't materialize for resources to probation-involved youth. This vision has as a goal ensuring that this county, with its $30+ billion budget, at more than when I was there, we were getting to a number that was close to over $1 billion for just probation services. 24-hour youth and community centers would be funded with youth programming, with restorative processes, and the YES teams connecting youth to additional community-rooted supports. I will say from my other work in the post-George Floyd era, where local jurisdictions, who I think are meaningfully trying to deal with the over-reliance on police, if the police are the only people working 24 hours a day, only county and city departments working 24 hours a day, we should not be surprised that when mistakes are made or distress happens, that people are funneled into the law enforcement process. And finally, this system imagines that for those folks who do are a harm to themselves or a harm to the community, we would shift from secure juvenile halls and camp facilities, which, as I mentioned, are in some cases not really fit for a young person to be in, and where youth are far from their family, they cannot return home while they're detained or incarcerated, would be replaced by safe and secure healing centers that create spaces for youth to receive trauma responsive services in small residential home-like centers that are closer to their families. And so those are the dimensions of this youth justice reimagined vision. I think the simple answer to your question, and again, this is informed by my many years of work with community-based social justice leaders, is that the decision makers and the voters are responding to social movement demands. And those demands don't just start with Black Lives Matter protests that happened after George Floyd. We see a series of intellectual authors of these more community-based and financially responsible systems that go back to social movement actors that have been working in this county really over the last several decades.
That's great. Thank you. I want to turn to Sharon next, and then we're going to take some of the questions. There's some terrific questions that are being asked, and I want to make sure we can get to at least a few of them. But before we do that, Sharon, I do want to turn to you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about the national picture about decarceration and COVID. And what that looks like through COVID Behind Bars, the UCLA COVID Behind Bars project. As you've told us, you've been tracking that. Can you give us a quick sense of what you've learned?
Yes. So obviously from the beginning of the pandemic, when people started to understand the nature of the virus, it was obvious that people who are held in crowded carceral facilities without the ability to control their environment, who can't socially distance, who might not even have masks accessible to them, who can't tell a staff member who's not wearing a mask to please step away. You know, they're all the kinds of things that are inherent to life in custody that make COVID so dangerous. And I will say that in the first 4 months of the pandemic, at the end of the first 4 months, we published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association where we reported that the infection rate disparity between incarcerated people in the country and free world people was 5.5, and people were dying in prison at 3 times the rate. So we knew, sorry, Kat, we knew that this was going to be a serious problem, and so did many stakeholders around the country, including law enforcement, prosecutors, judges. And so what we saw was an early mobilization by a number of public officials to try to reduce the population of their facilities as much as possible. And there was much more possibility of doing so in the jails rather than the prisons. So what we saw in the jail context was reductions in arrests, reductions in increases in grants of bail, and then releases of a lot of people who, to my mind, should never have been in custody in the first place. I mentioned before, misdemeanors, probation revocation, parole revocation. I mean, there are a number of categories of people who are in for what we think of as really minor infractions that were filling the nation's jails. What we saw was a drop of 25% nationwide in the jail population in the first 3 months or 4 months of the pandemic. On the prison side, there was a drop of about 9% across the board. That turned out to be somewhat.
Oops, Sharon, you're muted.
That was my cat, believe it or not. So we saw a much lower drop in the prison population because there's just not that many mechanisms for getting people out of prison. A lot of the drop that we saw, which was an overall 9% drop in the first 4 months, turned out to be people who were being held in the jails because they weren't being transferred to the prison. So it was just a temporary fix. It actually suggests the jail populations were dropping even more. I will say that over the last year or so, the jail population has begun to creep up. So most of the drop in population has now been erased. The overall jail population is where it was before. The prisoner population is somewhat lower, but not substantial. And so the bottom line is there are very few mechanisms for release, even in urgent situations where people in custody are in serious danger of unnecessary death, and that there isn't the political will to make it more meaningful. And I will say, just to pick up on something that Sewell was talking about a public health frame. What I've been saying from the beginning is what we need is to recognize that what we think of as public safety issues, but what I think of as protection from victimization. We need to think of protection from victimization as a component of public health, a kind of healthy societies approach. And I think if we did that, we would actually change to a great degree our perspective on how we should approach penal policy overall. And I'll just say that in terms of the disparity, our numbers show that after a year, the disparity is still 3.3 times in terms of infection rate and 2.5 times in terms of the likelihood of dying in custody. So the problem continues.
Wow, thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questions and we're only going to be able to get to a few of them. I'm going to combine a couple for this next one, which is, we've got one question about sort of where does bail and folks awaiting trial play in regard to this, how much of that is still a piece of the problem. And we have another question about more generally alternatives to prosecution that could become standardized or used within our system of justice. And so I guess these are kind of questions about the front end of things and how we can do better there to have a smaller incarceration problem to solve. And I guess I'd love somebody to weigh in on the how these fit together or the relative importance of each. Judge Armstead, it looks like you're getting ready to say something.
Yes, I can start. So alternatives to bail, I guess I'll start with twofold and then folks can add on to that. So when I said we looked at data, so the first thing we looked at are what are the locations in LA County that are booking the most people so that we can put resources there. We identified between, actually also from UCLA, there was the $1 Million Hoods project. So we use data from there, we use advancement project data that overlays. And then we also looked at county internal data to look at bookings. When we looked at the bookings, we learned that there were 8 jails, like local jails in the county of Los Angeles, that booked over 53% of the folks for the entire county. LA County has 88 cities. So there was 8 jails that booked over 53%. And so part of my budget, we are putting service providers in each of those jails. We actually have identified 10. So we've expanded it beyond the 8 to 10 locations. The challenge has been, so the first one we launched was at 77th Division, which covers all of South Los Angeles. Yesterday, there was one launched at Santa Monica. There'll be one in Lancaster, Van Nuys, Metro, Downtown, Long Beach, Pomona, Compton. There's a number of them. But one of the things for us to be able to do that, either the prosecution has to not file the case, or they have to be fine with the release, and so does law enforcement. So there's some things that have to happen. And so the DA, our current DA, is very progressive. So he has a long list of felonies that he's comfortable releasing. He also has a number of misdemeanors in jurisdictions where he handles the misdemeanors as well, that he's comfortable releasing. Local prosecution is not as progressive as he is in those ways. So there are things that the DA is comfortable releasing that the city attorney for the local jurisdiction is not comfortable releasing. But one of the ways that we're addressing that is being able to put service providers who can pull people out, link them to housing and services as soon as they're booked in the jail, so they don't go through the full process. Judge Espinosa also has a program called Project Lead, where before a person is even arrested, that they do an intervention in that space. We're working on making it so that folks at certain jails are assessed, that when they go to their first arraignment, that there are services and resources for them available to help advocate for the person being released, along with the defense attorney. LA County is different than other jurisdictions. Most people do not encounter their defense attorney until they're arraigned. So they've been arrested, they've been whatever, they're detained, and it's not until they go to their first arraignment date in court that they actually have their first contact with their defense attorney. So the process is a little bit belabored in our jurisdiction. Go ahead, Justin, if you want to add to it, go ahead.
No, I mean, so we've got so many questions that I want to know. That was hugely interesting, but I'd love to now have us go to sort of the speed answer version so that we can get just a couple more questions in before our program ends. One of them is the work that everybody's doing, how applicable is it outside of LA County? Are there things that are specific to LA about these stories, or are we also giving models nationally? Anyone want to jump in quickly and give us a sense of that?
Let me just jump in quickly and say 2 things. One is I have a hard stop in a minute because I have a meeting with Supervisor Mitchell's office.
Understand.
That's not a meeting I can be late to. The other is I think that a lot of the decisions that are being made around criminal justice transformation are politically driven and politically motivated. And if you don't have the right political environment, which we currently do in Los Angeles County, then it's difficult to replicate the programming that's going on in other places in more conservative jurisdictions. But the general response is yes, these programs can be replicated, but somebody has to have the political will to redirect resources, because the things that we're describing, they don't happen for free. These services have to be resourced and paid for and sustained. So that's my short answer. And I really apologize for leaving, but I am going to have to leave, and I'd love to come back.
We'd love to have you back. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
The rest of the panel, I'm going to ask you one final question, which is, and there's so many good questions we weren't able to get to, so apologies for that. But where are lawyers most needed? What careers and paths should students and new lawyers who are interested in decarceration and criminal justice reform, but don't necessarily want to go on to the public defender side or the progressive prosecutor side, what roles and spaces are there for them? I'd love a quick, maybe each of you can answer that in 20 seconds each.
My 20-second answer to that is I think that the mechanisms that are arising now are partly a function of how many community-based organizations have been able to marshal legal training, community organizing, and other types of skills in one place. So I invite people to consider the nonprofit sector as a place where these changes can happen and can really use the legal training that we get in a law school.
Great, thank you. Judge Armstead.
I'm going to go the opposite. So I would say 3 places. I would say 1, money talks. So I think anytime that you can sort of move dollars, I think that that's huge, whether that's through legislation, through an elected office, through foundations. We have a lot of lawyers that are involved. Our CEO is a lawyer for LA County, and also women, not just to plug women. We have an all-female board of supervisors, and our CEO is a woman. I don't think that's an error by why things are moving, and there's so many dollars moving, and there's such a huge shift. So I think that that's huge. But I would say definitely legislation, because it's one of our hugest hindrances. And then also money,
Great. Okay, thanks.
Let me just jump in and say, I mean, I think I agree with Sol and I agree with Judge Armstead. The other thing I would just say is that, if you are working, if you know how legislation works, if you're working on legislation, if you understand policy and are working in policy, if you understand the legal framework and are working, let's say, as an advocate on behalf of incarcerated people, I feel like there's so many players that we need all pushing in the same direction, and every individual person can really only do so much. So what I would recommend is find the milieu that is most exciting and meaningful to you, and then pursue that context, and then join forces with people across the board on multiple fronts, and working together. I think it's the only way we're going to move the ball forward in any meaningful way.
All right, well, thank you very much to all of our experts today for talking about this. Thank you to the UCLA Program in Criminal Justice too for all the work that it's doing. If you are interested in further events, I'm just going to bring 2 to your attention. They're also in the chat. On September 17th at noon, we are having a conversation about Texas's recent law and reproductive rights. And then we also have our annual Wither the Court event where we talk about both the last term and the next term in the Supreme Court on September 29th. So thanks for being with us today, and take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.